You're listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology.
Hello, everyone, again. My name is Bob Keane, and welcome to Fire Ecology Chats. I'm the editor-in-chief of the internationally renowned journal Fire Ecology, a journal that is published by Springer Nature and overseen by AFE, which is the Association for Fire Ecology. Today, we're going to talk about, I think, one of the most significant papers ever written that concerns fuel moisture, about how we've not done it well in the past and how we should do it well in the future. Today, we have one of my colleagues at the Fire Lab, Matt Jolly, talking about his new paper called Combining Ecophysiology and Combustion Traits to Predict Conifer Live Fuel Moisture Content, a pyro-ecophysiological approach, which I absolutely love. Matt, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Bob. My name is Matt Jolly for everybody out there. I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. I work at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory.
Matt and I, of course, have talked a lot about fuel moisture in the past and the way we measure it, how it has failed, and that doesn't really capture a lot of things. And this new paper, Matt, is incredibly important to the literature. Can you give us some background on why you wrote the paper?
Yeah, when I started working here, I started to recognize that the way that we were thinking about live fuels might be wrong. Yeah, essentially, that the assumption was that live fuels were just really wet, dead fuels, and that somehow, if you knew how the moisture variations played out over the course of a season, you could correlate them to things like drought indices and you could predict them. But the real challenge is that when you examine that moisture content equation, you realize that the variations of the numerator and the denominator of that equation, so variations in the water content and the dry weight, change in a live fuel over the course of the season. And really what we wanted to do is figure out a way where we could objectively decompose that water content and dry weight variation into metrics that we could measure for any species of plant across the world, and then correlate those, not really correlate those back, but actually create a mechanistic model of live fuel moisture content that when you combine those metrics together, they actually yield the live fuel moisture content quantity.
Yeah, that's wickedly important. It's really important that people understand that it's both ecophysiology and physics that determine live fuel moisture content. Tell us about this approach, this pyro-ecophysiological approach that you wrote about in the paper.
So the idea is that if we have a live fuel moisture content measurement, that measurement can be broken down into components that represent the seasonal variations in the water content and the dry weight content or dry matter content of the fuel. So we picked two really common ecophysiological measurements, one for water content, which is the relative water content, and one for dry matter variations, which is the leaf mass area or its reciprocal, which is the specific leaf area. And we combine those together with a couple of scalar quantities. One, the kappa, which describes the volumetric water holding capacity of a particular needle or leaf. And that, when you multiply those together, they give you the water content variations, or the kind of the numerator of that equation. And then when the denominator of that equation is just the leaf mass area times the surface area to volume ratio. And we know that surface area to volume ratio is a really strong indicator of species flammability or ignitability. And combining that together with a common physiological metric, when you work through the units of that equation, basically those four quantities multiplied together actually yield the live fuel moisture content metric without any regression, without any model. And they help us really understand why live fuel moisture content is varying the way it does at a given time for a given foliage age class or a given species. And it allows us to really decompose that into that water content variations and dry weight variations.
You know, after reading this paper, I restructured my entire thought on how live fuel moisture content changes throughout the year. I just hadn't thought about all that and how it all links together. I want to thank you for that. Are there important management implications for this approach and what it constitutes?
One of the big management implications is that all over the world, we're measuring live fuel moisture content, and we're interpreting that live fuel moisture content directly as a metric of flammability. And that's really challenging because we know from this paper that, especially for conifers in the Intermountain West, that we can predict almost all of the variation in live fuel moisture content just by knowing the mass variations for all those species without ever including the water content. So really thinking about how we're interpreting that live fuel moisture content metric that we're measuring, but then also thinking about how we can add some additional quite simple measurements as part of that sampling procedure to expand our view of how the actual live fuel moisture stress is changing, how the dry weight is changing, and use that to correlate back to kind of what we see for expected fire potential. So to expand from a typical sampling routine where we would go out and collect a sample, we weigh it fresh, and we would dry it, and we would calculate live fuel moisture content, you only need two 2 additional very simple steps once you know some basic species information. So you have to rehydrate the sample to get a relative water content, and then you measure the planar surface area of the sample to help you calculate the leaf mass area. Those 2 little simple additions allow you to actually measure this new components of the mechanistic model as part of a sampling strategy. So it allows us to really expand our ability to think about how we apply this stuff.
That is really great. It's really a wonderful ways that, there's really not much more we need to do to go ahead and implement this in management. Is there anything else you want to talk about in the paper, Matt?
Just want to emphasize that one of the cool things about this mechanistic model is that it allows us to really bring together a whole bunch of really valuable live fuel moisture content research that's been done over the last as many as 30 years. Recently, people have been looking a lot at how specific leaf area or leaf mass area affects live fuel moisture content variations and how either relative water content or leaf water potential play into that sort of dynamic. But what this mechanistic model can do is really help us bring all that research into a common framework. And then as we move forward, using these individual metrics of leaf traits and water content variations to synthesize and build on so that we're working towards a common goal of understanding what drives the live fuel moisture content variations and how does those individual components really affect true ignition or flammability.
That is great, Matt. I really, really want to thank you for coming on the Fire Ecology Chats today and talking about this very important paper. I hope it changes a lot of people's minds and restructures how we think about live fuel moisture. Is there any co-authors or funding agencies that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I really want to give a huge shout out to Elliot Conrad, Tegan Brown, and Sam Hillman. We all worked through this study together. Elliot was instrumental in leading all the field data collection, helping with the analysis, as was both Tegan and Sam, and has really been a team effort. It's actually been a team effort for a long time to get to this point. We were funded under a DoD certified grant for looking at live fuel flammability. David Blunk was the PI, we're co-I, so I want to thank the funding institution too.
You, Matt, and good luck with all the work that you're going to do in live fuel moisture. Guess what? If the listeners of Fire Ecology Chats want this paper, guess what? They can get it for free. Yep, that's free. Matt has already paid the freight for this paper. You can download it off the Fire Ecology website for absolutely no money whatsoever. Thanks, Matt, for being here, and please join in again for our next Fire Ecology Chat.
Thank you for listening to Fire Ecology Chats, a podcast series by the Association for Fire Ecology. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our show and leave us a review. To learn more about fire ecology and support our future work by becoming a member, visit fireecology.org. fireecology.org.